15. I know the early
We've
timers.
done it.
Idris! Hello, everybody. Uh, My name is Rebecca Lindell, and I am the chair of PERLOC, Physics Education Research Leadership and Organizing Council. And we're the ones who works with PERTG and helps make decisions and host the PERC and things like that. I want to welcome you all here today. I can see there are some definite people that are like, okay, I need to know how to write this kind of paper. Help me out, please, which we appreciate. Um, I I actually just I've met this speaker a couple of times, um, but nothing really groundbreaking. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Sarah McHale, who is one of our newest members of PERLOC, and she's going to introduce our speaker. Sarah, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited today to announce Torle Odden. He's an associate professor of physics and science education research at the Center for Computing and Science Education at the University of Oslo. So yes, he is all the way in Norway and is working late just to share his expertise with you.
It's
He
4:30.
has his bachelor's in physics from St. Olaf College, so he's always had strong roots in the liberal arts traditions, and you might see some of that coming through in a bit of what he'll share with you today. He also got his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he studied sense making. And right now, a lot of his work focuses on computation as a tool for students' development of epistemic agency and also how generative AI can be applied in large-scale qualitative research. Tor is someone you might recognize from his wide publications across PER and DBIR journals more broadly. And he has a wealth of experience mentoring students in writing very effective and clear PERC papers. So today he'll be sharing some of that expertise with us. So everyone, let's welcome Tor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Sarah. And I want to say just how honored I am to be speaking to you all and how excited I am to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is writing. I'm going to try and share my screen here.
Hope
All right.
that's okay.
So you should be seeing a title slide, 4 pages, 1 argument, writing effective PERC papers. So my thought was I wanted to start off with sort of a combination of theory and some writing activities. So we are actually going to be practicing a little bit of writing here, just a teeny bit. And then once we've gone through that, we'll move into sort of a discussion phase. So just as kind of a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about here, I want to highlight 3 essential skills, sort of the core things that I consider absolutely essential for writing any paper, but especially a PERC paper, which I will say is one of my favorite formats because it kind of forces you into this. First, the skill of getting into the writing state, which we are going to call the flow state, and we'll be working on an activity to get everybody into that flow state. Next, articulating your argument and thinking about the different parts of what goes into a good argument in the context of a paper like a PERC paper. Auditing your argument, so reviewing and checking over and figuring out whether the thing that you thought you were arguing for is actually landing. And because we're living in a weird cyberpunk future world with generative AI, I also want to have a few comments and a little bit of discussion of the potential role of AI in this writing process. And I'm a person who really likes webcomics, so I'm going to be featuring various comics from my favorite webcomic author, Tom Gauld, on the writing process. Highly recommend if you haven't already read any of his work. All right, so let's get into it. So first part, getting into the flow state. So I really like this quote here. The art of writing is the art of applying the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. Because a big part of the writing process for any paper, and especially a PERC paper, is just getting yourself into the headspace where you can actually sit down and take those ideas that are floating around in your head and put them onto the page. And in this regard, there is a tool that I discovered during grad school that I've always kind of thought of as a little bit of my secret weapon. This is something that we're going to use here, and I'm going to recommend for PERC papers. But even beyond that, anybody who is in the dissertation stage or even beyond, I cannot recommend this tool enough for writing. There's different versions of it, and the one we are going to be using is known as the most dangerous writing app. Okay, so what I would like everybody to do is to go onto your web browser of choice and to Google the most dangerous writing app. And if you do this, I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I want to share my my other screen here. You will see something like this. And I want you to click on the top link, this one from Squibbler, which is the most dangerous writing app. So this is a tool that is designed to help people get into what is commonly called the flow state. This is a term from psychology for basically the state where you kind of lose track of time and you kind of lose track of space and you're just sort of there. It happens with jazz improvisers, jazz musicians. Sometimes when they're improvising, it happens with writers. You know, hopefully you recognize this kind of state where you're just sort of so focused on something that everything else drops away. This is a tool to help get you to that state. So the way it works is you set the length of your session, which we are going to set for 5 minutes, and you click on the Start Writing button, and you get a blank page where it just says Start Typing. And so you can start typing. Now, the key thing about this is if you stop typing, then your words start to fade away. So if you don't type for more than, I think it's around 10 seconds, then it deletes everything that you have typed and you go back to your blank page. This is a tool that is somewhat stressful, but it is designed to force you to write continuously without stopping and without distraction for however long your session length is set to, 5 minutes in this case. And what I would like us to do here collectively, I would like everybody to open up this tool. And I want us to take 5 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I'm going to do this as well. And I want us all to spend 5 minutes writing on the prompt that I had on my previous slide, which I will go back to. What is the primary argument of your article? In other words, what is the thing, the core idea that you want your reader to walk away with, summarized ideally in 1 to 3 sentences? Is everybody clear on the task here? Yeah. Okay. So I am going to give a little countdown, and then I want everybody to spend the next 5 minutes. We're all collectively going to do this. And those of you who are watching the recording, you can do this as well, writing using the most dangerous writing app on this topic. All right? On your mark, get set, go. All right. I believe that should be around 5 minutes, so I'll give folks a couple more seconds to finish up. Um, I think we can address this a little bit more in the discussion, but if you're anything like me, the first like minute or two is really stressful and you're just stream of consciousness typing. And I will say that this tool isn't especially effective for making polished prose, but I find it very good for knocking loose ideas or taking things that I didn't quite have articulated and finding a way to articulate them and sort of put them down or oftentimes there's a section in my paper that I don't quite know how to fill, and this helps to give some raw material to fill that section of the paper. So usually after about the first minute or two, things start to kind of fall into place and the flow state starts to take hold. And after the 5 minutes, I often find myself tempted to keep on typing and keep on writing, just because I've gotten into that groove. And so that's the goal of this tool is basically to get you into that writing state so you can just kind of keep on going after the 5 minutes are up. Okay. So, next up, then I want to move on. So that's sort of the first part, getting yourself into the flow state, getting yourself to the writing state. The next kind of big idea that I want to get across here, is the notion of an argument. So I gave everybody a prompt here, which was to articulate your argument. But what I did not do was to define what I meant by an argument. And here's another Tom Gold comic for everybody to appreciate. Yes. I want to go to some argumentation theory here to talk a little bit about this. So, if you read any of the science education or history and philosophy of science theory on argumentation, you may have encountered this framework. One of the most common variations is Tolman's framework of argumentation, where an argument basically is theorized to consist of three key things: your claim, the thing that you are trying to convince your reader of; your evidence, the stuff that you are trying to provide in order to support your claim; and the reasoning, which is the connection between the claims and the evidence. So this is a very important thing to have in the back of your head when you are writing your PERC paper. Whenever I go into any sort of paper writing, the first thing that I always try and have in place is my claim, the thing that I'm trying to convince my reader of. I want to be very clear on the thing that I'm trying to argue for before I even go into writing a paper. If I don't know what I am trying to argue for, it's very hard to write a paper arguing for that thing. On top of that, you obviously have to have your evidence. This is usually your data. So if you are writing a qualitative paper, you will usually have some kind of data in the form of, an analysis of an interview, quotes, potentially excerpts from survey responses, that kind of thing. If you are doing a quantitative paper, you are going to have your numbers, your statistics. But the important part, and the part that people oftentimes forget about or miss when they are first writing these papers, is the fact that you have to connect your evidence to your claim. You have to walk the reader through the ways in which the quotes or the theory or the things that you are holding up to support your claim actually do support your claim. And this is a very important aspect of the paper writing process. You need to make sure that you are very clear about these kinds of connections. We can come back to this a little bit in the discussion. So if we had enough time, and if I were running this as sort of a full-on workshop at this point, I would set aside 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes where everybody spends some time dissecting what is their claim, what is their evidence, and what is the connection between the two, what is the reasoning. But since I'm trying to go through this fast so we can get to the discussion afterwards, I'm just going to move on to the third point with a brief webcomic break. and talk a little bit about what we do once we have our argument articulated, how we debug the argument. So there is a practice that I learned in grad school that I still do to this day that I find extremely helpful for this, which is reverse outlining. So let's say that you have managed to sit down and you have managed to apply your butt to your seat and write out a full draft. You have clarified for yourself the claim that you are trying to make, the evidence that you are presenting, and the reasoning, the connection, and you have put all of that down on paper. The next step is to spend some time going back through your work and trying to figure out whether the argument that you think you are making is actually coming through. And this is a technique that helps with that. It's called reverse outlining. So basically what you do is you take your paper and you try to approach it as if you were a fresh reader, as if you had a fresh pair of eyes. And this is a difficult task, especially if you are writing a PERC paper in a relatively abbreviated period of a few weeks. So the way you do it is you go through each paper, or you go through each section of your paper, paragraph by paragraph, and you try to write a summary of each paragraph that is as authentic to what is on the page as possible. This is very important. Your summary should not be what you were trying to get across. Your summary should be what is actually written within this paragraph. And you create essentially what is a reverse outline of your paper, an outline based on what is actually there, what is actually drafted. This is very useful for two reasons. First off, if you have a lot of different ideas in a single paragraph, it becomes very clear. And that's a marker that you should probably break up those paragraphs. And you should try and make sure that each paragraph is only making one claim. Each paragraph is only trying to say one thing. But more importantly, it gives you a diagnostic for how your paper flows and what is actually written, which allows you to then take a step back and ask yourself, is what is written here actually what I want to be written? Are these points that I have pulled out in this reverse outline actually making the argument that I want them to, or are there places in which things need to be revised, things need to be changed, or otherwise I need to go back and debug my argument? Okay, final point before we open up into full discussion, and I sort of summarize this first part. How does AI fit into everything? So, one thing that I've come to realize recently is that using AI in the writing process is quite a controversial practice in some circles. This was honestly a surprise for me because I am a person who really appreciates AI and has a lot of fun with it, but I have friends and colleagues who view it as a total non-starter and have in fact taken their names off papers when it turns out that those papers had AI as part of the writing process. So the first point I want to make is within your writing team and within your author team, please be sure to check with your co-authors ahead of time on what is and isn't allowable in terms of using AI in the writing process. This, I think, is just good practice going forward, and it should be done as early as possible so you don't end up in a situation where you have used AI in the writing process, and then it turns out one person on your team is deeply uncomfortable with that, and you run into conflict. My personal philosophy, this is just sort of Tor speaking, this isn't the CCSE or any other people's views, is that the ideas, the raw material, must come from the researcher. I am very uncomfortable with situations in which people get raw material or ideas directly from an AI. I think our purpose as humans is to understand the arguments that we are trying to make, the evidence, and to try and put that down on the page. However, I do think that it is potentially fruitful to discuss those ideas with AI, to go back and forth as a way to sharpen your argument. And once you have that raw material, this is again Tor's philosophy, I feel that it is productive to use AI to sharpen ideas or arguments and polish language or structure. My personal philosophy is I would rather read a paper that is well written, where AI was used to more clearly communicate the researcher's ideas and get those points across, than a paper that was done entirely without AI, where the quality of writing ends up clouding the main argument that I really want to get at. If you want to learn a little bit more about this, there was recently a very nice opinion piece that came out in the Chronicle of Higher Education that I would say sort of summarizes my philosophy to AI in the writing process. Here's a little QR code link to it. AI can improve scholarly writing if we use it right. I'm also happy to share a PDF of that with folks if they contact me afterwards and don't have access. So, in summary, then, before we get to the discussion, my big sort of outline of the PERC paper writing process. The first step is to identify your argument, be clear on the thing that you are trying to convince your reader of. And this is a thing that you will continually come back to. Oftentimes, the argument you originally thought you were making does not end up being the argument that you actually make in the final version. But at least be clear when you are going in about what you originally intend to convince your reader of. Next, outline and draft your paper. This is where the most dangerous writing app, I think, comes really in handy to get you into that state where you can put these words down on paper. Then spend some time auditing your argument. This is where reverse outlining fits into the process and potentially AI feedback. AI can be a useful tool for getting feedback on how your argument flows and potential weak points in that argument, as well as, of course, advisor feedback or colleague feedback. And then finally, there's the step of revising and polishing. Once you have gotten that feedback, you will want to do at least one revision of your PERC paper and go back through and try and address any points that came up in that process of auditing. And here is a final little webcomic. All right. And with that, I will say thank you, and I look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
Or
please.
maybe I'll at least kick us off and inspire other questions. One of the things that I feel like I find myself running into with PERC papers is exactly that argument refining thing you're talking about, right? Where you come in, you say, this is what I'm writing the paper about. And I tend to come in with too much. And I say 4 pages, do. And by the time I talk about what I'm talking, by the time I can talk about what I want to talk about, how I want to talk about it, I've had to narrow it down so much. Um, I'm wondering if strategically there's a more effective way I could get to that point earlier. I'm
Gosh, that is a really good question. And one that I don't really have a good answer to. I mentioned early on that PERC papers are one of my favorite paper formats, and I really like them because they force you to do this narrowing down process. And oftentimes when I'm writing a full paper, I find that I end up doing sort of an everything in the kitchen sink approach where like I just stuff my paper with different arguments and ideas. And I think a PERC paper is really useful because the space constraints force you to think about what is the single thing that is most important that I get across, and what are the single pieces of evidence that are most useful to get that across. So as much as it's a challenge, I kind of view this as a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
Like, the fact that you have more arguments, you have more ideas is very productive. And that means that when you write that full on paper, those will go into the paper. But yeah, as to how exactly to do that, I don't have a good answer to that. It's just something that you sort of, the more time you spend on it, the more you simmer on it, the more you move things around, figure out, okay, this is the thing that I really want, and these are other things that are less important that I can cut. And eventually, you end up in that 4-page format.
And if I can contribute something, when it comes to trying to figure out what's going to fit inside that 4 page limit, something that I've found is helpful is when it comes to actually putting words on page, uh, I find that it's easiest to write like methods, evidence, and discussion section before all of the front matter because like that is the part that I'm adding, and it's the part that my paper has to have. It does not matter what any of the front matter is if I don't have that. And so starting there can give you a better idea of how much literal space, how many pages is that going to take up? Because if it's a pretty concise thing, then maybe I have more room to do that kind of like situative front matter. But if it's a really large piece, then it's like, oh, maybe I'm either going to have to be really quick with my introduction to my theory, or I need to take out some of this evidence. I don't have room to actually supply all of what I'm trying to put in before I then frame it with all of the front matter in the conclusion.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, Jared, and thanks for bringing that up. Most papers that I write and that my students write are sort of grown from the middle outwards, as you say. So, oftentimes, if you're writing a qualitative study, you should, by the time you start writing, have a pretty solid idea of the argument that you're making, of your theory, of your methods, and of your results or your evidence. And the introduction and sort of the conclusion and perhaps even the discussion oftentimes sort of grow out of those as you figure out, okay, this is the thing that I am trying to say. And once I am able to say it, this is why it is meaningful. That's sort of the discussion and the stuff that comes at the end. And this is how I want to contextualize or motivate it, which is at the beginning. So I seldom see people start just from the top and write an entire paper sort of top down. That at least for the people in my group and the people I work with, seldom is the path to getting to a full paper. Other questions or comments or thoughts or I mean, I think we should make this more of a discussion than a kind of a Q&A.
Yeah, if I can throw a question out to everybody, I was wondering what people think about how you should structure your writing time. I've always been someone where it's like in my calendar, I want to have like a 2 hour block on 2 days a week to write out stuff. Do people think it's better to have like 4 1 hour blocks during the week? Is it better to have long sessions that are uninterrupted, or do you think it's something where you write for an hour, like think about it until the next day? Um, what do people prefer?
I'd actually like to run this as a little activity if folks are okay with it. I This is one of the activities that I usually start my writing workshops off with. Take like 3 minutes and think about the most ideal writing time and space for you, like where you get your best writing work done. And then once you have it, I'd like everybody to write that in the chat. Because in my experience, it's a very individual thing. I've heard some people write best between 2 and 4 a.m. Some people who write best in a coffee shop next to their best friend at 10 a.m. Some people who write best, after the kids are asleep. It's a very individual. So let's take 2 minutes, and once you have identified your ideal writing time and space, please put it into the chat. So to answer your question, Idris, you can look across all of these comments here, and there's definitely some consistent themes, but with great variation. Um, One thing I like to highlight is everybody kind of works differently in this regard. We all have different circadian rhythms. We all have different sort of productive times. I've seldom met anybody who can get a lot of writing done in less than an hour. Um, always it seems that people need like at least 1 to 3 hours. And of course, there's an upper limit, unless you're trying to cram at the last minute, which I do not recommend for PERC papers. But as you can see, a lot of sort of late morning, mid morning, early afternoon, but then some folks prefer sort of later than that. And yeah. So I think the big takeaway is to spend a little bit of time figuring out like where is my ideal writing time, and then try and block that off in your schedule in some way, shape, or form. So make sure that those really, really good times are set aside for writing, especially during sort of the few week period where you need to be most productive on this kind of thing. Prioritization is a really important aspect. Josie.
Yeah, awesome. I just would love a follow-up on this is what are people's strategies for the cases where basically I'm in a space where I am trying to write several papers at once, and that is basically my only uh major task. So, what are people's advice on how to block out um cases where you are writing multiple things? Is it focusing on one at a time versus bouncing back and forth between the papers? And also how to ensure that as much of the day goes toward productive writing of something as possible, because there just aren't that many other things I need to be doing right now.
So I can kick off a bit of a response here, but I think we've got a lot of writing expertise here in the room. Can I ask a question, Josie? Are these papers sort of on related subjects, or are these very distinct papers?
A mixture of both.
Okay. Because if they're on related subjects, then that's a little bit of a different thing than entirely
But
sort
like,
of
yes, assume in
orthogonal.
this case that they are that what happened was I had my funding pulled, therefore I got on a whole bunch of short grants with things,
Ah,
and sometimes the only similarity is that they're PER papers.
yeah. Yeah, okay. The one thing I will say is I think for most people there's a certain amount of creative bandwidth that they have in the day, and beyond that it is very hard to sort of push past unless you have parts of a paper that really don't require a lot of creativity where you're just sort of banging out words on the page. So my go-to strategy, and I'd like to hear more from other people, but my go-to strategy is to try and sort of say like, okay, I know I can write productively, creatively for X number of hours in the day, usually around 4 to 6 hours if I'm really going strong. And if I absolutely need to get something out on a deadline, then I just set aside some more time where my brain isn't going to be fully engaged, but I can at least write some details on the method section, or I can write, stuff that isn't that important and interesting, but just needs to get out on the page and sort of divide it up into like the productive, juicy creative time and the just getting it on the page time. Passing the word over to Brian, unless you have another question.
Mine's in response to Josie's question. This is not always feasible to do. So only try this out if you've got the space and the agency to do this. But I always try to, if I can, stagger my writing activities so that I've got one paper in the drafting stage, one in the revision stage, one in the editing stage, one in the return from comment stage. Obviously, that one you can't really control the timing on. But that task switching can be helpful because then I can have 90 minutes of drafting followed by 90 minutes of editing, and it's better than 3 straight hours of drafting or 3 straight hours of editing. And also trying to time that with I'm going to draft for 90 minutes and send it to my co-author so that I cannot work on it because otherwise I'm making changes to things that I've already asked them give feedback on.
And if I can chime into Josie's question as well, the metaphor that comes to mind for me is it's like when you have a knot and you need a massage, but it's in a deep muscle, where when the massage starts, you can't just go directly to it. You have to work through all of the big muscles on top of it before getting to the point that it needs. I find that when I'm starting into a writing task or something, there's an amount of like obstacle to I have to be in this space for a prolonged period of time before I can really get into that really nuanced refinement that is going to make this paper what I want it to be. So I personally find that spending long times focusing on a single piece of work tends to get me deeper into what that particular work needs rather than switching from paper to paper in rapid succession. So, if that seems to resonate with you, I would recommend long stretches with just one piece or one paper.
Piggybacking off of that, sometimes what happens with my students and some of the other papers that I've written is when you are spending those long stretches on the single paper, you end up with way more writing than can fit into a single paper. And for pretty much every paper I've written, I always have a second document called the scrap heap, where I take that text that I've written that is no longer useful and copy it over as I'm editing down. And oftentimes the scrap heap actually becomes the follow-up paper. It becomes another paper sort of on similar topics on the same data set with a lot of the same ideas that I couldn't put into the first paper. So that was my question about related versus unrelated papers. If you have related papers on the same data set, sometimes you can kind of assemble them in parallel using some kind of strategy like that of dividing up what does and doesn't fit into a single paper.
Well, I have another question that I would love to pose to the group regarding what you mentioned about the use of AI in writing. I do appreciate your explication of saying like make sure you talk to your co-authors. I think it's good to establish those kinds of like community norms. And on that subject, I would be curious to hear what folks' views are on disclosure. I've found that like across the board, it's fairly common that people seem to feel like if you use AI in the process that you should disclose it. But I would also be curious of like, what do you think is the best practice for disclosure? If I'm going to put it in my paper, do I toss it in the very end at the acknowledgement section? Do I talk about it like in the methods section in the same place that I would discuss the steps I was taking for analysis or any like changes I had to make in my process along the way? So where would you put it and how would you talk about it?
That is a really good question. I'm curious to hear other folks' thoughts on this, and especially for PERC papers. I feel like there may need to be some guidance on this for the community. Um, I mean, I see some journals where they require an explicit AI use disclosure statement at the end. And I feel like that could very well be a model for our PERC papers where it goes, after the 4-page limit in sort of the acknowledgments and the other back matter. I definitely see some papers where it shows up in the methods section, but usually just as like a very minor statement. AI was used for polishing language or something or other. I think it's more common in if you're actually using it in the methods, like if it's used to develop code or other things like that. So uh, yeah, I guess I would broaden the question a little bit to not just what are people doing, but what should we do as a community here?
Just to chime in, I do think if someone is using AI to write, they should definitely disclose that near the end, like where funding information, conflict of interest statements. That's where I've seen it in most of the papers in other disciplines, like biology ed or chemistry ed. Um, so I think that seems like the default spot for it, and I think that those should exist. I don't know if there's a good paper that someone's done that sort of loads up a framework for like this is how scientists have agreed in some workshop or conference, this is how this should be disclosed. Does anybody know of something like that?
I'm trying to find it. I want to say PRPER has something about it, like very clear that like it's not an author, but it could be acknowledged. Like I'm trying to dig for it and I'm struggling. But I think it would probably be helpful for PERC to have something similar because you don't write a letter to the editor. If you were to write a letter for the editor to the letter to, oh my gosh, a letter to the editor, to me, I think that's a place where it makes a lot of sense to be transparent about it. But then also you want the readers to know too if you're telling the editors. With PERC, you have this interesting thing where like I think by and large people kind of just take a lot of, for example, acknowledgments might not be, they might be identifying. So if people just take that out, are they going to accidentally also take out any sort of AI disclaimer? Um, I think that to me it makes sense there, but I could also see an argument for the fact that maybe folks would feel differently about knowing how something was conducted. And if it's used in if it's used in an analysis stage, I think it has to go in methods. If it's used in writing, I think the same way you would, I don't know, acknowledge somebody who provided formative feedback on an article in acknowledgements. I think I would see it fitting there.
I mean, it also depends a little bit how heavily you're using it in the writing process. Like if you're using it for formative feedback, that's a very different thing than if you're using it to draft up your original manuscript. And where this becomes especially important for me is as a peer reviewer. I've gotten some papers in my review queue recently where, as near as I can tell, they just used AI to write the entire thing. And there isn't any disclosure. And that makes it challenging as a reviewer to say, like, were you intellectually lazy and just used AI to write this entire thing? Or are you just a bad writer? And I can't really tell those two. So I wonder if that shouldn't be an important component here as well, that reviewers should be able to know, as they're reviewing, in this case, PERC papers, how heavily AI was used in the writing stage and at what parts.
This also brings up the question of direct versus because I've written for some journals that very much want an AI disclosure more in the education space. Whereas the direct versus indirect use. Direct use is the outputs of the AI are likely to be in the paper versus indirect use, which is the sort of thing like I used the AI to as a sparring partner to decide which argument of a few I thought was the strongest, or I need to suddenly understand a portion of the literature that I do not have time to review on my own. And so I go into it and then I synthesize some things. I say this and then I ask it to find counter arguments to make sure I'm not missing a counter argument that, is going somewhere in those sort of things where maybe there's no text in it, but it found some sources that I then read and put into my thing. That's a very different workflow than if the text that the person is reading, because in that, whether it's giving me inputs to my own mind or it's acting as a afterwards. And that was something that was very clear in some of the norms is like, where is it being used in the process and to what extent is it translating into actual text that the person would read?
I also know we're getting kind of close on time. Maybe I'll ask one kind of last question, unless if anybody else has one.
I
I'm
have one
wondering
thing I
if
was gonna share.
for folks who might be newer or anyone watching who's never written a PERC paper before, if you, Tor, or anyone has kind of big picture advice for kind of how to anticipate what reviewers are looking for. Are there things that if this is someone's first rodeo, like any other details that might be peaceful, not or helpful pieces of wisdom as we get ready to go out and write.
Yeah, so generic feedback that typically comes from reviewers, there's often a few places where they will especially pick at your paper or your argument. So one is the research questions. First off, there should be research questions in our field. There should be an articulation of the thing that you are trying to, understand or unpack or analyze, and sort of what your goals are with that. And they should be well aligned with your theoretical framework and with your evidence and your arguments. So many times when I get feedback on my papers or I give feedback, I focus there. Another area is the background and literature. Oftentimes, reviewers will say, "Hey, you talked about this, but there's also this. Could you incorporate that?" And I wouldn't view that as like an attack necessarily. In fact, I think that's a very productive thing that a reviewer can do, because they are essentially giving you kind of a leg up and showing you additional parts of the literature that, either you missed or weren't aware of, or perhaps didn't feel were as important, but as an audience and a readership, they can identify as important. Um, then oftentimes there will be sort of questions and pushback and critiques of the analysis. And that also, I think, is a very productive thing for reviewers to do, to say, like, as a reader, do I buy your analysis or not? Are there claims that I feel are not fully backed up? And if so, taking a very productive view of the reviewing process, which I think is warranted based on my experience with the PERC proceedings. That again is really helpful to get feedback uh, on sort of how your argument and your use of the evidence lands. Overall, I would say that you should view the review process in the PERC proceedings as a community of other people who know this subject quite well, who are there to help you to sharpen your argument. And sometimes that can be a little bit more antagonistic than others. It depends on your reviewers. But most experiences I've had with PERC papers, they are there basically to help you address issues or weaknesses and improve the quality of your work. So you shouldn't view this as like goal keeping or as a negative thing. It's people giving you feedback that, because it's anonymous, can be more direct than what your advisor or other people who sort of know you can give.
And I have something else I would add for newcomers. This is something that my advisor caught in a lot of my writing early on. So thankfully it got caught before the reviewer, but still was feedback that I had to hear a lot before I mastered, which is uh, having a theoretical framework that never shows up after the introduction. Like if you have a theory that is you're bringing it up, it should be your North Star through essentially the rest of the paper. That as you're going through the methods, why did you make these decisions? Because it aligns with the framework. As you're going through your analysis, why can I make this claim confidently? Because the theory says I can. Like going back to this, the argumentation theory where you have the claim, evidence, and warrant. Your theory is essentially like a scaffolding for your warrant, saying if you find such and such evidence, then you should be able to make such and such claim. And so if you're presenting the evidence, presenting the claim, and then not mentioning the theory that connects the two, then why did you bring it up in the first place?
If I can add on to that, Jared, one revision practice I've adopted at some point after I've got my full manuscript, probably after I've done like the section pass to make sure the whole thing flows, I get three highlighters. And one's for claim, one's for evidence, one's for reasoning. And I highlight every sentence. And if I can't figure out how to highlight a sentence, that sentence needs to either be revised or it needs to go because it's not actually advancing my argument. And then I can look over and say, I don't have a lot of pink. I should be adding more pink to really emphasize that part of the argument.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of that and Jared's comment, I think the big takeaway here is that you don't want things kind of coming out of nowhere, and you don't want things that show up and seem important and then kind of disappear. And oftentimes, again, this is something where you sort of grow a paper from the middle. So sometimes I find a really nice implication that I want to put into my paper, and that means that I need to add some extra stuff into my background section. Or I have this theoretical framework, and if the theoretical framework shows up in the introduction or the first sections, then it really needs to be present, as you said, Jared, in the methods, in the results, and in the discussion and conclusion. So cohesiveness is incredibly important here. And if things, as you were saying, Brian, if things only show up a little bit at various points, then that is a big red flag. And that's something that reviewers, if they are good, should pick up on and should push you on to fix up.
I think we have time for one more question. If it's quick. I guess there are no more further questions. I want to thank everybody for coming. A couple of announcements. First, PERLOC will be considering the what the statement, AI statement for the PERC proceedings is. We may not get a statement before papers are due or anything like that. But it's on the agenda. It'll be there by next year, hopefully. Also, this is the first part on writing a PERC paper. And I know a lot of people, especially if they're new to the community or they're solo PR or something like that, they also need to know, how do you review an article? I mean, I read the guidelines that my postdoc advisor gave me. How to start a review, how to do things. And even if you're a novice starting out, your contribution is valuable. Oftentimes it goes to wordsmithing. I don't bother looking at wordsmithing anymore. I mean, if it's really that bad, awkward, out the door. But that's the thing. Also, Liam, can you remind me what the day is for the next one?
Yeah, the next one's going to be May 28th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. It's going to be Rachel Schur talking about how to review a paper broadly, but specifically PERC papers.
So we're trying to keep these things together going. If you enjoyed this community conversation, please join us for the next one. We also have things scheduled for the whole summer, except for July, but we have the town hall during, and that counts. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you very much, Tor. Really, your presentation was very valuable.
Thank you for the invitation, and I will look forward to seeing you folks this summer.